American tanks are nothing but harmless toys. That was the line German soldiers often used to joke with one another. In 1943 to 1944, from the Normandy front all the way to the Ardennes, no one failed to fear the sight of a German tank. A single Tiger could hold back an entire company. A Panther from 2,000 meters away could already turn a Sherman into a blazing wreck. In bunkers lit by oil lamps, German officers would point at maps, tap their pens, and recite the formula that had become a kind of gospel: 2,000 against 100, 20 against 1. The numbers were solid, sharp as steel, unquestionable. They believed in the legend they had created themselves, and they laughed at the thought that Americans could produce nothing more than ordinary Shermans. But then, in the grey depths of winter, when a strange shadow with a massive gun barrel appeared, all that laughter fell silent. Germany, 3:47 p.m., March 6, 1945. The air over Cologne Cathedral Square was thick with dust and the choking haze of bombs. Fragments of shattered brick from collapsed buildings lay strewn about like the white bones of a city that had once been one of Europe's most splendid. The great bells of the city's cathedral had long since fallen silent, giving way to the deafening roar of explosions. Nearby, inside the cramped driver's compartment of a Panther Ausf. Karl Hoffmann pressed his eyes to the periscope, straining to see through the cracks that had just split open after a violent jolt. He wasn't sure whether it had been caused by enemy shelling or simply the tank lurching as its tracks crunched over rubble, but one thing he was certain of: even through the spiderweb of fractured glass, he could clearly see the massive pitch-black shape lumbering toward him. There was no doubt it was an American tank, but unlike anything he had ever seen before. Karl had served in the Panzerwaffe for 3 years. He knew every contour of the M4 Sherman by heart: the humped hull, the rounded turret like a stew pot, the pitiful 75mm gun that a Tiger could brush aside from over a kilometre away. He knew the Stuart too: small, quick, nimble, but nothing more than a toy in front of a German 88mm. He was even familiar with a few rare variants, like the Sherman Jumbo, heavier and clumsier with its extra armour. All of those machines he could name at a glance, but the thing now emerging from that ruined street was different. "That's not a Sherman," Karl blurted out, his voice trembling slightly as it came through the intercom, silencing the entire crew. They had never seen him rattled like this before. Through the cracked scope, Karl saw the massive gun barrel jutting out of the shadows. It was longer than anything mounted on a Sherman, so long he thought it might be a Flak 88, the kind that could only be mounted on a fixed platform. The turret of the American tank was oversized, looking like a gigantic helmet clamped down on the hull. The hull itself was low, sloped, with armor plates that seemed cast in one solid piece rather than welded. Its silhouette was utterly foreign to every recognition chart he had studied in tank school. Karl bit his lip. He remembered those dry hours on the training grounds, officers droning on about every detail, from the driver's hatch to the angle of a Sherman's turret, followed by the exercise drill: 5 seconds to identify the enemy. But this machine wasn't in any of those lessons. It had appeared like a phantom, something even Germany's intricate intelligence network had never warned about. Inside the cramped compartment, the crew's breathing grew heavy. The gunner, Otto, whispered, "Hey Karl, is that a jumbo?" Karl shook his head. "No, it's different." The distance between the two tanks shrank quickly, barely 100 meters now. In theory, that was a killing range for the Panther. Their 75mm KWK 42L/70 was famous for its high muzzle velocity, capable of slicing through the armor of any Sherman as easily as crushing a piece of tofu. At this range, one solid hit would turn the American tank into a blazing wreck. But Karl's hand hesitated, unwilling to give the order to fire. In his mind, another voice whispered, "What if it isn't as easy as a Sherman?" He thought of Wilhelm Bartelborth. the commander of another Panther that had been destroyed only minutes ago. Not a single crewman survived to report what had happened. There had only been a single thunderous blast, and then silence. Carl had reassured himself it must have been anti-tank guns or artillery. But now, staring at this American machine, he no longer believed his own reassurances. "Prepare to fire," Carl said, forcing his voice to sound steady, though his legs trembled uncontrollably and his uniform was already soaked with sweat. On the other side, the American tank kept advancing slowly, steadily. Dust streaked across the top of its turret, as if it had crawled through miles of mud and ruin. Its long gun lowered, aiming squarely at the Panther. That was no toy 75mm. Carl thought back over the past 3 years. The first time he had seen a tiger on the training grounds, the rush of pride in his chest. We are invincible. He remembered the glowing reports of victories. A single tiger stopping an entire company of Shermans. Wittmann torching the British column at Villers-Bocage. He recalled how Allied soldiers trembled whenever they heard the words, "tiger in the area." They called it tigerphobia. For the Germans, it was the one faith left to cling to in the long months of retreat. Even if we are outnumbered, our tanks are still better. But now, that faith was crumbling inside Carl. "Fire!" Carl finally managed to order, summoning what courage he had left. The blast roared through the compartment like thunder. The 75mm shell shot forward, slamming straight into the Americans' front armor. At barely over 100 meters, there was no chance it could miss. For an instant, Carl believed he had won. But only for an instant. Through the cracked scope, he saw sparks flash. Then the round ricocheted away, shooting upward, leaving a burning trail across the sky, as though it had struck a tilted mirror of steel. There was no explosion, no billow of black smoke, no victory. 3 seconds later, the answering roar split the air. The American tank fired. The 90mm armor-piercing round, with terrifying velocity, covered the 100 meters in mere milliseconds. Carl didn't even have time to blink. He only felt the compartment shudder, a hot blast of air rushing through. His comrades screamed for just a heartbeat, and then silence, as fire engulfed them. At that moment, Carl Hoffmann understood. The legend had shattered. December 1944, bleak and grey, with wind cutting through the bare trees of the Eifel. In a makeshift bunker, the dim glow of an oil lamp fell across faces young but hardened by gun smoke. Carl Hoffmann pulled his heavy cloak tighter around his neck, his breath clouding in the cold air. Resting on his lap was a sheet of paper, its edges frayed, folded and refolded so many times that the creases shone smooth. It wasn't a letter from home, nor an order. It was a penetration chart issued to every Panther crew from day one. The numbers stood out clearly under the weak light. KWK 42 L/70 penetrates 138mm at 1,000 meters. Just below, M4 Sherman, frontal armor 63mm, turret 75mm. Carl ran his fingers over the numbers. In the biting cold, the rows of figures glowed like a hidden ember. He felt his nerves steady. No matter if the enemy outnumbered them 10-1, mathematics was still on his side. Reading that chart again, Otto, the gunner, propped his chin on his hand and smirked. "You've got every number memorized by now." "I just want to be certain," Carl answered, eyes fixed on the line of text. Otto snorted. "Certain, huh? Then listen to this, Wittmann." The bunker erupted. Everyone knew the name that had become legend. Michael Wittmann, the Steel Knight of Villers-Bocage. A single tiger charging into the British lines that June, ripping apart an armoured company in just 15 minutes. 14 tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, a dozen trucks, all turned to ash. One man alone, Otto raised his tin cup, the cloudy liquor sloshing inside, and the whole street laid to waste. Shermans, nothing but cheap toys. Rough laughter rolled through the bunker. For a moment, the cold was gone, replaced by the warmth of pride. Karl took a swallow of the liquor, the burn shooting up into his nose. He stayed silent, but inside he felt steadier. The image of Wittmann's tiger was like a guardian angel on the battlefield. Just the mention of it made every man hold his head a little higher. The next morning, they marched out to the muddy training field for drills. On a wooden board, the instructor scrawled 2 crude rectangles. This is the Panther. This is the Sherman. He drew a long line and wrote, 2,000 meters, then a short one, 100 meters. Remember this well. At 2,000 meters, we destroy them. At 100 meters, they finally have a chance against us. 2,000 against 100. 20 to 1. He rapped the board sharply with his pointer. So let the Americans or the British crawl closer. With their pitiful short range, they'll never reach us. Young faces lit up with confidence. A formula as simple as multiplication tables, as solid as steel. Karl swallowed that lesson whole. In his heart, the number 20 to 1 became a talisman. Early in 1945, they were stationed near a main road that cut across a frost-covered field. Karl and his crew positioned their Panther on a rise, the hull hidden behind rubble, only the turret exposed. In the distance, engines rumbled. Then a column of Shermans emerged from the white mist. "There's a lot of them," the driver, Ernst, whispered, his hands tight on the controls. Karl whispered back, almost like a prayer, "But mathematics is on our side." "Target, 1,800 meters, Otto said, his eye pressed to the sight. Karl nodded and shouted, "Fire!" The gun thundered. The armor-piercing round screamed forward, and the lead Sherman exploded, a column of fire rising into the sky. The whole column faltered in confusion. Otto chuckled darkly as he rammed in the second round. The second Sherman went down, then the third. Black smoke billowed high, the wind carrying the stench of burning fuel all the way to Karl's position. Crews in the rear cheered inside their cramped compartments, laughter rising above the thunder of the guns. By noon, the fields were littered with a dozen smouldering steel carcasses. Karl leaned back against the tank's armor, drawing in the hot smoke with a deep breath. There. Mathematics never lies. That night, in the makeshift tavern, they retold the story as if it were already legend. Otto waved his arms as he described, "That Sherman lit up like a candle. I swear I saw the turret fly straight into the sky." The young soldiers listened wide-eyed, as though hearing a saga. But, amid the raucous laughter, Karl caught the somber gaze of a staff officer. The man was studying a fresh report, his hands trembling under the lantern light. A Panther had been knocked out at 1,500 meters, the turret face pierced clean through with a single shot. "Just anti-tank guns," Karl heard someone say. "Must have been an ambush." The officer folded the report, slipped it into his pocket, and hurried off. Karl pretended not to care, but when he returned to his tank, he felt a weight in his chest. The familiar numbers still rested in his pocket, but suddenly it was as if another, unwritten number was waiting in the shadows, ready to force its way into the equation he had memorized by heart. A few days later, they captured some American prisoners. One of them, shaking, stammered, "Tiger! Tigers everywhere!" Even though there hadn't been a single tiger in the area, only panthers. Otto burst out laughing. "See? They jump at their own shadows and call it a tiger." Karl laughed too, but his chuckle felt hollow. He remembered that report, and he knew not every tiger shadow was a trick of the imagination. Somewhere out there, the Americans might already be finding a way to kill them. He kept that thought to himself, not out of fear, but because he knew, if his own doubts slipped out, the entire crew would lose faith. And in war, faith mattered as much as guns and shells. One evening, they halted at the edge of a forest. Karl climbed out of the tank and stretched his back. Off in the distance, the sun bled red as it sank behind the hills. He picked up a branch and drew in the dirt, one large rectangle, tiger. Next to it, a smaller one, Sherman. He scratched a long line, 2,000 meters, then a short one, 100 meters. He looked at the crude drawings and smiled. Simple, clear, certain. Ernst walked up, glancing down. "What are you sketching?" "Our equation," Karl said. 2,000 against 100. 20 to 1, Ernst nodded. "Yeah." Mathematics doesn't lie. Karl brushed his boot across the lines, erasing them, but inside him a spark of doubt flickered. But war is full of lies. Then came March 6th, 1945. When Otto's 75mm round flew at the American tank from barely 100 meters, Karl braced himself for the familiar result. A Sherman erupting in flames, another proof of the invincible equation. But instead of black smoke, he saw only a flash of sparks, and the shell glanced off, as though it had struck a wall of steel. In those 3 frozen seconds, the entire 20 to 1 formula collapsed. And when the flash of the American gun answered, Karl understood mathematics could fail if you had left out one unknown. Detroit, 1942. The city pulsed like a giant machine newly awakened. When the sun went down, instead of falling into darkness, the northern sky glowed with the light of hundreds of factories. Elsewhere, evening meant rest. In Detroit, night was simply another shift. The streets swarmed with trucks hauling steel and fuel, tires hissing on wet asphalt, the whistle of riverboats echoing across the frozen Detroit River. Smoke poured from factory stacks, blending with the clouds like a proclamation. This city had become the beating heart of industrial democracy. They called it the arsenal of democracy, and never had the title fit more than now. Among the hundreds of plants spread across Detroit, the Fisher Body Grand Blanc Arsenal was one of the busiest. Before the war, it had built car frames. Now, with its lines retooled and extended, thousands of workers labored around the clock, 3 shifts a day, turning out Sherman tanks. The transformation had been breathtaking. Hands once fitting car windows now welded armor plate. Women who had worked as secretaries now stood at stamping presses with scarves tied over their hair. Taxi mechanics now tightened bolts on tank treads. The machines thundered endlessly, an industrial symphony, loud, relentless, but steady. And within that rhythm, a secret was taking shape. Inside a steel-fenced compound under armed guard, a group of young engineers huddled around drawings no outsider had ever seen. George Miller, his eyes bloodshot from days without leaving the drafting table, had just finished the final schematics for the one-piece cast turret of the T-26E3 project. He held the thick stack of papers, layers of pencil lines marking every detail, armor thickness, slope angles, the mounts for a 90mm gun. Stepping out of the room, he was met by the roar of the foundry, the acrid stench of molten metal making him wince. Under yellow lights, men in heavy aprons carried vats of glowing steel, pouring them into massive molds. Sparks flared in their eyes. None of them knew the full truth. They thought they were building an improved Sherman. In reality, they were creating what history would later call the Pershing. In Detroit, nights were no different from days. At 11 o'clock, the factory whistle shrieked to signal the shift change, and hundreds of workers streamed in, their faces marked with fatigue but hardened with resolve. The men were gone to the front, many never to return. So here it was, wives, sisters, and mothers who kept the lines moving. One woman, Mary, pulled the lever of a stamping press, sweat running down her face, yet she smiled as she thought of her son fighting in France. Every piece of armor she shaped might be the one that saved him. On the assembly line, the parts rolled past in steady rhythm. Heavy treads, brand new transmissions, Ford GAF V8 engines rumbling on test benches. One group bolted, another inspected, every movement coordinated with precision. Fast, sure, relentless. The greatest difference with Germany lay here. The Germans built Tigers the way they built luxury cars. Meticulous, handcrafted, weeks for each machine. The Americans built Pershings the way they built automobiles, on assembly lines, standardized, with speed and volume as the priority. That difference was the unknown factor in the equation men like Karl Hoffmann had never imagined. While Detroit blazed with light, at Fort Knox, Kentucky, a group of young soldiers were undergoing a strange kind of training. Sergeant Robert Early, once the commander of a Sherman crew, now sat inside the turret of a new tank, his hand resting on the massive gun in front of him. The instructor rapped the barrel with his knuckles, his voice booming. This was the 90mm M3 gun, firing a 24-pound shell with a muzzle velocity of 3,000 feet per second. It could pierce 119mm of armor at 500 yards, and with tungsten rounds, that figure rose to 221mm, enough to crack even the thickest plate of a King Tiger. Early thought back to Normandy, to the sickening memory of 75mm shells from his unit bouncing off Tiger armor like stones against a wall. Now, for the first time, he felt he could settle the score. The instructor repeated over and over that everything here was top secret. A single word outside could mean court-martial. Once in Europe, they would have to pass themselves off as ordinary Sherman crews. The young men nodded, eyes gleaming. Inside them burned a hunger to test this steel beast against the Tigers. Back in the plant, George Miller walked the line, watching steel plates hammered into shape, one-piece turrets cooling in water baths. He knew these machines would save soldiers like Early. He thought of his friends, boys his own age, who had fallen in the Ardennes, of the telegrams that read only "missing" or "killed in action." Quietly, he promised, "We'll send you what you need." January 1945. Snow blanketed the port of New York. Under the glare of floodlights, cranes lifted massive tarp-covered shapes and lowered them into the holds of ships. On paper, they were listed only as heavy maintenance equipment. In reality, they were the first 20 T-26 E-3s. The crews chosen to man them stood silent on the pier, bundled in thick coats, their breath clouding in the frozen air. They were not allowed to say much. They only looked at one another, eyes burning with a shared truth. We will be the first to take the Pershing into battle. The ship's whistle blew, and it eased away from the dock. Below deck, the great iron beasts lay in rows, waiting to be unleashed. In just a few weeks, in a shattered square across the ocean, their guns would thunder, and that moment would mark the collapse of Germany. Detroit's lights burned on through the night. The whistle sounded again. Another shift filed in. The pounding hammers, the machines, the crackle of molten sparks never ceased. And so, dawn broke. But this was not just dawn for Detroit. It was the beginning of a new age of tanks. In Cologne, Karl Hoffmann still clung to his 20-to-1 equation as though it were a charm. But across the ocean, the Americans had already added an unknown variable. And when the morning light fell across Antwerp, the Pershings would roll off their ships, not just tanks, but proof of the miracles American industry could achieve. Winter winds whipped hard across the ships crowding New York Harbor. On deck, snow piled up so quickly that soldiers had to keep shoveling it clear. That night, the floodlights from the cranes swept across the water, casting shimmering streaks of gold. The massive Liberty ship groaned as heavy steel shapes were lowered into her hold. No one on the pier was allowed to call those shapes by their true name. On paper, they were listed as heavy maintenance equipment. In truth, they were 20 beasts, 20 T-26 E-3s, tied down and covered in thick tarps like caged animals. Robert Early stood among the chosen crews, his heavy coat pulled tight, his breath clouding white in the cold. He watched his tank being lowered into the ship's belly. No one in the group dared laugh or talk loudly, as though a single stray word might give the secret away. They only glanced at one another, eyes glinting under the yellow lights. "We'll be the first," someone whispered, then quickly fell silent. Early gave a small nod, his heart pounding. Inside him was a strange mix: pride at being among the first to test a weapon no one had ever taken into battle, and dread at the sheer weight of what they carried. The ship's horn let out a long, mournful blast like a bugle of farewell. Steel cables screeched, sailors in wool coats rushed to cast off the lines, and slowly the ship edged away from the pier into the river. The city lights faded behind them, leaving only the grey, cold immensity of the winter sky. Below decks, in the dark, the Pershings lay silent, frost clinging to the tarps like night mist, settling on the backs of hibernating beasts. Crossing the Atlantic was always a gamble. Winter seas rose like mountains, and out there, German U-boats prowled like packs of wolves. Early knew it. Everyone knew it. They'd all heard the stories of convoys smashed apart, of troop ships sunk with hundreds lost, leaving only scraps of wood and life jackets drifting on the waves. But this time, the ships carried more than men. They carried a secret that could turn the tide of the war. On the first day at sea, the cold cut like a knife. The ship pitched hard, sending soldiers retching over the rail. Early gripped the handrail, staring as waves crashed over the bow. His mind drifted to Cologne, a place he had never seen, but suspected might be where he and his steel beast would roar for the first time. At night, they crowded into their dimly lit quarters, the lamps casting a dull yellow glow. Clarence Smoyer, his gunner, whispered, "Think the Krauts know yet?" Early shook his head. "They think we've only got Shermans." That's how it has to stay, until the last moment. Smoyer gave a quick grin, eyes flashing. "I want to see the look on a Tiger crew's face when they meet this thing." Below deck, the Pershing sat motionless, but each time the ship rolled, it felt as though they shifted slightly, like restless animals stirring. In the hum of the engines, Early sometimes thought he could hear them growl, low and deep, muffled by the heavy tarps. On the fifth night at sea, the alarm shrieked. Sailors scrambled, voices shouting through the loudspeakers. U-boat! U-boat off the port side. Machine guns barked on deck, red tracers streaking into the darkness. Early ran out, his heart hammering. The sea was black as ink, the wind howling, white spray flying high. For a terrifying instant, he saw the ship torn apart, the Pershings plunging to the bottom with all their hopes. He clenched his fists and mouthed a prayer. Then, from the distance, came the deep rumble of depth charges. The escorting destroyers had reacted in time. That night they escaped, but the sense of danger hung over them like a blade. The days that followed were grey and endless, the seas heaving against the steel hull. Soldiers lay in their bunks listening to the thud of waves pounding the sides. Some counted the hours, willing the voyage to end. For Early, each day dragged on like a year. He thought back to the gunnery trials at Fort Knox, the 90mm shaking the earth, steel targets shattering to pieces. He remembered the instructor's warning. When you reach Europe, you must disguise them. Don't let anyone know what they are. The thought made Early chuckle to himself. How can you hide this? The gun is too long, the turret too big. But then he understood. In the confusion of the battlefield, one tank silhouette often looked much like another. Perhaps the enemy wouldn't realize for weeks that a new predator had joined the hunt. On deck, the wind was so sharp it burned the skin. Early wrapped his scarf tighter around his neck and stared out at the ocean. The water was silver grey, waves rising endlessly like a chain of mountains. He thought of some German tanker sitting in a panther, clinging even now to numbers. 2,000 meters against 100, 20-1. Early felt a surge inside him, a hunger to be the first to prove that equation was already obsolete. On the 11th day, land finally appeared. Antwerp harbour lay shrouded in winter mist. The Liberty ship eased in slowly, its horn echoing across the docks. American soldiers and Belgian workers waited, watching curiously as the tarped shapes were hoisted ashore. No one knew exactly what they were, only that they were bigger than any Sherman. Special trucks stood ready to haul them away that very night. The secret remained intact. Early stepped off the ship, breathing in the biting cold. He laid his hand on the flank of his Pershing as it was lowered to the pier. His hand was numb with frost, but his heart burned. The Atlantic crossing was done, but the real danger lay ahead. Ahead was Germany, Cologne, the Tigers and Panthers. And he knew that soon, in the ruins of some city street, the roar of the 90mm would echo, and for the first time in years, the fear would flow the other way. The ship had done its duty. Detroit had delivered its steel monsters to Europe. Now it was up to the crews. They stepped ashore, carrying both the weight of a secret and the spark of a new faith. Inside them was a mix of nerves and certainty that in just a few weeks, history would shift. Germany, February 1945. The sky was leaden, heavy clouds pressing down on bomb-scarred fields. The road into the town of Elsdorf was a churn of mud, tank tracks grinding the last patches of winter ice into cold slush. Houses along the way were gutted shells, their roofs scorched away. The air still held the stale stench of gunpowder, mingled with coal smoke and rotting carcasses. Down that ruined road, Shermans trundled forward, their guns raised like broken spears, and among them, for the first time, rolled something different. Lower, heavier, with a massive turret and a gun that stretched like a new spear point. The Pershing. Robert Early sat behind the driver, peering through his slit. The cabin smelled of oil and grease. Clarence Smoyer, his gunner, adjusted the big gun, eye pressed to the sight. The crew said nothing, only the 4GAFV-8 rumbled in the back. They'd been warned. Never reveal this was a new tank. On paper, they were still just another Sherman outfit. But all of them knew, crammed in that steel box, they carried a secret that could change the game. The night before, in camp, they'd heard the scouts' warning. Tigers near Elsdorf, waiting in ambush. Those beasts had haunted Shermans for months. To meet one head-on usually meant death. Early remembered the nightmares he'd lived through before, always with German tanks at the heart of them. But with the Pershing, his chest felt different. Not dread this time, but anticipation. As the column neared the town, a deafening blast ripped ahead. Earth and stone flew skyward. A Sherman on the left erupted in flames, black smoke gushing up. Screams cut short in an instant. Early clenched his teeth, eyes sweeping. "Tiger! In the rubble! 11 o'clock!" he barked. Clarence swung the gun. A tiger's shadow loomed behind broken brick walls, its 88 poking through. "Range! 700 meters!" Clarence called. Early's voice was tight. "Fire!" The 90mm thundered, the whole Pershing shuddering. The round ripped through the air, slamming square into the tiger's turret face. A flash like lightning, then a sound like thunder tearing the earth. The massive turret snapped back, flames blasting from the view slits. In seconds, the mighty tiger, once untouchable, was nothing but a burning wreck. Inside the Pershing, silence. Clarence pulled back from the sight, eyes wide. "Hit! Dead on!" He shouted it again, half disbelieving. Early stared at the inferno, his heart pounding like a drum. The Shermans halted, American soldiers on the tanks raising a roar that shook the street. For the first time, they had seen a tiger pierced from the front, at a range they had never dreamed possible. A new faith swept through them like a wave. But the fight wasn't over. An 88mm shell screamed back, smashing into the Pershing's turret. The impact shook the crew to the core, sparks flying. Early staggered, ears ringing. But as the smoke cleared, they saw it. The sloped armor had held. The shell had left a deep crater, but hadn't gone through. Clarence swore, yanking the gun back around. 12 o'clock! Range! 800 meters! This time Clarence didn't wait for another order. He squeezed the trigger. Again the 90mm roared, the tank shuddering as the round streaked away. In the distance, another tiger jerked, its armor erupting into fragments. Then came a long silence. Smoke billowed from the two wrecked Tigers, blotting out the grey sky. The Shermans rolled forward cautiously, as though their crews couldn't quite believe what they had just seen. Early drew a deep breath, his trembling hand resting on the seat. He knew this wasn't just a victory. It was a declaration. The age of Tiger dominance was over. News of the battle at Elsdorf spread like wildfire. Intense that night, American soldiers whispered to each other, "There's a new tank. Long gun, big turret, knocks out Tigers like nothing." The rumor reached even the Germans through captured prisoners. Reports up the chain described strange American tanks with unusually long guns that had destroyed Panthers at ranges greater than ever before, but they didn't call it Pershing. To them, it was Das Langrohr Sherman, the long-barreled Sherman. They couldn't believe the Americans had built an entirely new tank. To their minds, it was only another variant of something familiar. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Early and his crew weren't allowed to speak much about the battle. The next morning, ordnance engineers came to photograph and measure the deep gouge left in the Pershing's armor. The men were ordered to keep silent, yet their eyes betrayed them, pride impossible to hide. Clarence wiped down the big gun, muttering under his breath, "We just rewrote the math of this war." That night in the darkened Pershing, Early couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the wind howl outside, thinking of the enemy. Somewhere, in some cold German bunker, a Panther crew was poring over their penetration tables, reciting the same numbers, 2,000 meters against 120 to 1. Early smiled. That chart no longer told the truth. The fight at Elsdorf had lasted only minutes, but its echoes spread across the front. It was the opening shot, the announcement to both sides that from now on, the game had changed. March 6th, 1945. The sky over Cologne was a dull grey. The once brilliant city lay in ruins, its grand buildings reduced to piles of rubble, thin smoke drifting over shattered rooftops. Amid the devastation, the great cathedral still stood, its twin spires stabbing into the clouds like black lances. The bells had been silent for months, but the building itself endured, an unyielding witness to a war nearing its end. In a shelter near the square, Karl Hoffmann pressed his eyes to the periscope of his Panther. The glass was cracked, but clear enough to scan the wreckage of the street ahead. He knew every line of a Sherman, tall hull, flat frontal plate, stubby gun. But what now crawled out of the ruined street was nothing he recognized. A low, sloped hull, a massive turret rising like a steel helmet, a long, heavy barrel unlike anything he had ever seen. Karl's heart pounded. He shouted into the intercom, "That's not a Sherman!" The crew went silent. Since the war began, they had trusted the tables. Tigers and Panthers could rip Shermans apart at range. Shermans had to rush in suicidally close to stand a chance. But now before them loomed a shadow that shattered all those equations. A shriek split the air. The Panther's 75mm belched fire, the shell slamming into the enemy's front. Hoffmann held his breath, waiting for the familiar sight, the Sherman bursting into flames. But no, only a flash of sparks, the shell bouncing skyward as though it had struck a steel mirror. The crew froze. In those 3 short seconds, they knew. The invincible formula was gone. On the other side, inside a Pershing nicknamed Eagle 7, Robert Early was ready. In the cramped cabin, Clarence Smoyer steadied the gun. His breath held, the crosshairs locked on the Panther's turret. Before Hoffmann could give the order for a second shot, the 90mm thundered. The whole Pershing rocked back. The round covered the 100 meters in a blink, slamming straight into the Panther's frontal turret armor. A sharp metallic crack, and then a terrible blast. Steel blew apart, flaming fragments spraying out. Fire burst from the vision slits, black smoke rising in a thick column. In moments, the Panther was a burning torch, its crew with no chance of escape. Across the square, American cameraman Jim Bates caught it all on film. Through his lens, the panther erupted in flames, smoke curling up against the towering cathedral. That image would later become iconic. The moment the legend of the invincible tiger and panther collapsed. Inside Eagle 7, Clarence still had his eye pressed to the scope, wide and disbelieving. He shouted, "It's burning!" "We got it." Early laid a hand on his shoulder, a strange feeling surging through him. Not the simple thrill of victory, but the weight of witnessing an era shatter before his eyes. But the fight wasn't over. Across the square, another tank shape emerged. Through the thick smoke, it was impossible to tell if it was a tiger or a panther. Only one thing was certain: it was deadly. "Quick, Clarence!" Early shouted. The gunner swung the sight, adjusted, and fired. Another thunderous roar shook the square. The 90mm round screamed across and slammed into the enemy. A second fireball erupted, the cathedral's spires casting their shadow over the rising smoke. In just a few short minutes, the machines German soldiers had once believed invincible were reduced to cinders. The Americans on nearby Shermans roared and cheered, their voices echoing through the shattered square. After months of living in fear of tigers, they now saw the opposite with their own eyes. The hunter could be destroyed with a single shot. In other bunkers, word spread like wildfire. "There's a new Sherman. Long gun, heavy armor. It knocks out panthers head-on with ease." German officers scowled, refusing to believe it. How could America, a nation known for mass production, not refinement, possibly create such a machine? Inside Eagle 7, Clarence wiped the sweat beading on his forehead, his hands still trembling. I can't believe it. We just killed both a panther and a tiger from the front." Early looked around at the burning wrecks, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. He knew this battle was more than a tactical win. It was a message. It would spread across the front through stories, reports, and the film Jim Bates had just captured. And once the Germans heard it, the talisman called Tiger would lose its power. Smoke still churned across the square, the acrid stench of burning steel filling the air. The great cathedral stood motionless, bearing silent witness as the once feared predators turned to ash. On that cold grey stone, a new chapter of armoured warfare was being written. In the days after Cologne, the smell of burned steel still clung to the ruined streets, but the shockwaves carried far beyond the cathedral square. It wasn't just 2 tanks destroyed, it was a legend collapsing. Reports poured in from the front. A new kind of Sherman, unusually long gun, armour so thick that 75mm and even 88mm shells bounced off like stones. At first, staff officers dismissed it as confusion in the chaos. But as more reports came, doubt grew harder to ignore. In a makeshift camp in the Ruhr, Karl Hoffmann sat with other Panther crews, listening to the talk. Some insisted it was just a Sherman fitted with an anti-tank gun. Others swore it was a brand new design. A young corporal, just pulled from the front, growled, "I saw it myself." It killed our Panther at over 1,000 meters. 1 shot, 1 explosion. We didn't even fire back. All eyes fixed on him, stunned. Inside Hoffmann, the numbers that had once brought comfort now felt fragile. For 3 years they had relied on the formula, 2,000 meters against 120 to 1. It was a charm, a shield. Nothing frightened them more than losing that certainty. And now, a new variable had entered, tearing the equation apart. Panic began to seep in. A platoon along the lower Rhine claimed they had faced only ordinary Shermans. But when they saw a few with longer barrels, the entire unit broke and fled, abandoning their defences. Later, they learned the tanks were just upgraded 76mm Shermans, not Pershings at all, but that no longer mattered. In German minds, any American silhouette might be the new beast, the one that could swallow a tiger whole. In damp, dark bunkers, officers tried to steady their men. "Don't be fooled. It's just another Sherman variant," but even they faltered as the reports piled up. Panthers pierced from the front, tigers knocked out at ranges once thought untouchable. The shadow of the Pershing didn't just haunt the battlefield, it invaded their dreams. At the front, a veteran Tiger commander confessed to his crew, "I'm not sure anymore. Before, I fired first and knew the enemy couldn't answer back. Now, I fire, but my heart trembles, fearing their shell will come straight through." In reality, Pershings were few in Europe. Barely a few dozen reached the front, but the truth didn't matter. In the minds of the Panzerwaffe, their numbers swelled into the hundreds, even thousands. One unit reported 10 Pershings in their sector when not a single one was there. Fear magnified them. The Americans quickly noticed the effect. They joked that all it took was painting a barrel a little longer and German tankers would quake. One officer laughed, half in jest, half in truth. "We've only got 20, but to the Germans it looks like 2,000. Meanwhile, German crews began abandoning their old habits of counterattack. Once, Tigers had charged boldly, firing from range to stop American advances. Now, many units chose to retreat or dig in, avoiding battle. Each time they saw dust on the horizon, they wondered if it might be Pershings, and that doubt alone was enough to paralyze their will to fight. At a prisoner interrogation in late March, an American officer asked a captured Tiger crew why they had abandoned their tank and surrendered. The commander, barely in his 20s, but with a face gaunt as a man of 40, answered simply, "We heard you have a new tank." If that's true, then the war is already over. His words carried no fleeting fear, only bitter acceptance. Deep inside Germany, at the Panzer training school still clinging to operation, instructors were bewildered. They had no recognition charts for the Pershing, no manuals, no tactics for countering it. All they had were the old boards. How to kill a Sherman, how to face a T-34. But those lessons no longer held weight. The cadets listened, but doubt flickered in their eyes. Even doctrine itself had been broken. Hoffmann, in the last days of the war, sat inside his Panther with a strange emptiness. He still drove, still scanned through his periscope, still issued orders, but the faith that had carried him through battle after battle was gone. Before, when he went into combat, he believed he had at least one edge: thick armor, a powerful gun, safe distance. Now, whenever he saw dust rising from American columns, he found himself asking, Sherman or Pershing? If it's Pershing, do we have any chance? And that hesitation, even for a fraction of a second, was enough to seal the fate of a crew. That state of mind spread across the Western Front like a contagion. It wasn't loud like bombs falling. It was quiet, steady, gnawing at the Panzerwaffe's will to fight. A report at the end of March stated plainly, "Crew morale has declined severely. Numerous cases of tanks abandoned while still combat capable." These weren't just statistics. They were signs of an army that had lost faith in its own pride and steel. By the time the April sun broke over Germany's torn fields, the Panzerwaffe was no longer the force that had once terrorized France or Russia. In their hearts, they carried a new fear, the fear of the Pershing. Spring 1945 arrived in Germany not with fields of flowers, but with black smoke billowing from ruined cities. Cologne, Bonn, Düsseldorf, all pocked with bomb craters, bridges snapped in two across the flood-swollen Rhine. Amid this chaos, a special report reached Berlin. In the lower Rhine sector, German troops had recovered an abandoned American tank. Not a Sherman, but the machine frontline troops whispered about with dread. The long-barreled Sherman. The tank lay in an open field, one side scorched, but the turret intact. A Panzerwaffe engineering team was rushed to the site. Cold drizzle stung the tops as they stripped away the charred armor, damp smoke still rising. The lead engineer, a thin man with thick spectacles, climbed atop the turret, his hand trembling as he touched the unusually long barrel. He gasped, 90 millimeters! Impossible! That caliber should only exist on fixed anti-aircraft guns. The group fell silent. One knelt to study the seams, frowning. This isn't welded plate. It's one-piece cast. We've never managed anything like this at this scale." They crouched around the turret as though it were some machine from the future. Curiosity and despair mingled in their eyes. Inside the crew compartment, everything was clean, logical. The seating was broader than in a Tiger, with padded cushions. The electrical system still lit, though the battery was half drained. A young engineer blurted out, "They even have a map-reading lamp in here." A trivial detail, but to Germans accustomed to cramped Spartan interiors, it cut like a blade to their pride. When they opened the ammunition racks, they discovered the anti-flash system. Rounds stored in water jackets, the so-called wet ammo stowage. An officer hissed between his teeth, "How many of our crews have we lost to exploding ammo racks? And they thought of this long ago." The hurried report went back. M3 gun, 90mm, heavy sloped armor, one-piece cast turret, electric traverse twice as fast as the Tigers, roomy and efficient interior. Each line made Berlin's officers scowl deeper. They had believed the Americans cared only for numbers, cranking out fragile Shermans. Now, before their eyes, was proof America could produce not only in quantity, but in quality equal to, even beyond their own. That news spread through the ranks like oil across water. In bunkers, tankers passed around rough sketches, fingers trembling as they pointed out a bigger gun, a larger turret, solid sloped armor. Some tried to laugh it off. Well, at least we won't be bored with Shermans anymore. But the laughter rang hollow, fading quickly. In their eyes, something had collapsed, the belief that German technology was the unchallenged pinnacle. On a retreat road near Essen, Karl Hoffmann sat inside his Panther, leafing through a small handwritten notebook borrowed from a comrade. In it were detailed notes about the new American tank. He kept rereading the line about the ability to fire while moving thanks to a stabilized gun. His head swam. For years, Tigers and Panthers had been praised for their firepower, but to hit accurately, they had to stop, aim carefully, then fire. Now, the enemy could shoot on the move. That crushing advantage was gone. He looked up across the shell-pocked fields. In the cold wind, the thought hit him like a blow. So everything we once believed was wrong. In a rare move, German engineers allowed a group of Tiger crews to see the captured Pershing firsthand. The men circled it, hands brushing the scorched armor. One muttered, "If the Americans can build hundreds of these, we don't stand a chance." No one answered. Only the wind hissed through the wreck like a cold reply. Later interrogations of German prisoners confirmed it. The moment they learned of the Pershing was the moment their faith collapsed. Before, even in retreat, even in defeat, they had still believed they commanded the most powerful tanks in the world. That belief had been their last wall against despair. With the Pershing, that wall cracked. Worse still was the truth of industry. In just a few months, the US had shipped more than 300 Pershings to Europe, and in Detroit, over 2,000 had already been built. A panzer officer, reading the figure, laughed bitterly. "We spent 3 years making a little over 1,000 Tigers. They need only a single season to double that." His laugh wasn't joy. It was the hollow bitterness of a man realizing he had fought inside an illusion. At night, Hoffmann sat alone, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks of his dugout. He remembered his first days in the Panther, the rush of invincibility when his gun could pierce anything at long range. Now, only weariness and emptiness remained. In the dark, he whispered, "If even engineering no longer belongs to us, what do we have left to fight with?" No one answered. But the question echoed in the minds of thousands of German tankers in the spring of 1945, as they understood that the Pershing was more than a machine. It was proof that American industry had raced beyond their reach. And with that realization, truth laid bare, faith broken, the Panzerwaffe had lost not only the battlefield, but the war of will. By April 1945, Germany was no longer the unstoppable war machine of years past. In the skies, Allied bombers rained destruction day and night, turning cities into ash. On the ground, columns of American and British tanks rolled forward relentlessly, tearing through the last fragile defences. From the east, the Red Army pressed in on Berlin. Everywhere, German tank units and infantry fell back in exhaustion. Countless tigers and panthers were abandoned by the roadside, hulking carcasses left behind like dead beasts. Karl Hoffmann sat silently in his Panther, the engine sputtering weakly, the fuel gauge on empty. Around him, his crew was quiet, no one speaking. Just weeks before, they had comforted each other with the notion that the Pershing was only a rumour, just another Sherman variant, but no longer. News from Cologne had swept the front, with photographs and reels of film shown in Allied propaganda halls. A panther burning in front of the great cathedral. The death of the legend had been broadcast to the world. Even among German ranks, the whispers spread. If Cologne is gone, if even the panther can be pierced, what is left to hold on to? Along the muddy roads, Hoffmann passed abandoned tigers with turrets askew. Tracks slipped from their wheels. None bore fatal wounds. They had been left for trivial failures, a broken tread, a stalled engine. Months earlier, crews would have risked their lives repairing them under fire. Now, they walked away or surrendered. Fighting spirit had burned out like smoke. At night in the shelters, sighs outnumbered conversations. A young sergeant whispered, "They say the Americans have built over 2,000 Pershings." 2,000. His voice trailed off. Another shook his head. "We made how many Tigers?" 1,300. How many King Tigers? Not even 500. And each took a month to build. Them? A few days, a few hours on the line. No one argued. They all knew it was true. In restless sleep, Hoffmann dreamed of the numbers he had once clung to. 2,000 meters, 100 meters. But now those numbers cut into his heart. From the cracks, a low silhouette emerged, with a massive turret and a long gun reaching forward. It came closer and closer. He jolted awake, his back soaked with cold sweat. In the dark, he heard his comrades stir, moan softly, then fall quiet again. No bombs were needed for this kind of fear. It gnawed in their dreams. On April 21st, 1945, at Dessau, Karl's unit was ordered to hold the bridge across the Elbe. They dug in, positioning what panthers and tigers they had left along the bank. But when the dust rose on the far side of the river, hesitation gripped every man. Were they Shermans or Pershings? No one could be sure. The mere thought of facing a 90mm gun made their hands shake, their eyes dart nervously. When artillery cracked from the other side, some panthers backed away before they even saw a target. Within a day, the line collapsed. The Allies took the bridge, and they had hardly fired a shot. After that, the unravelling was only a matter of time. Tiger crews, once considered the elite of the Panzerwaffe, now raised white flags. In the prison camps, American officers were astonished to see more tankers surrendering than infantry. Robert Early, meanwhile, was moving through central Germany in Eagle 7. His Pershing had been through several fights, its armour pitted with dents and scars, but it was still running strong. Early sat in the commander's seat, peering through the slit, and saw German soldiers raising their hands from afar, abandoning intact panthers. It felt strange. Back in Normandy, a single tiger had been enough to send an entire company into a panic. Now, just the sight of a Pershing was enough to make the enemy flee. Clarence Smoyer gave a dry laugh. "We don't even have to fire anymore. Just show up." Early answered with a booming laugh. He knew the truth. War wasn't only about shells and steel. It was about belief. And Panzerwaffe's belief had died the moment they learned of the Pershing. In the east, the Soviets were closing in on Berlin. But on the Western Front, The rumble of Pershing tracks sounded like a funeral drum. Each tank was a monster in the German imagination. That shadow, that psychological weight, was the deadliest weapon of all. On May 2nd, Berlin fell. Just over a week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. In prison camps, Panther crews huddled together, whispering that the moment they heard of the Pershing was the moment they knew the war was lost. Not because of endless Shermans, not because of the bombers overhead, but because the certainty they once clung to, the belief in German technological superiority, had crumbled. Karl, now a prisoner, sat behind barbed wire, his arms wrapped around his knees, his eyes hollow. He remembered evenings by lantern light when he first studied the penetration tables and felt invincible. He remembered the days when tigers and panthers rampaged across Europe, when pride swelled in his chest. Now it all seemed like a distant dream. He asked himself, had that faith always been an illusion? And if so, what had they fought for, died for, killed for? Across the ocean, Detroit still blazed with light. The lines kept turning out Pershings into the fall, even though the war was nearly over. Later, in museums, a Pershing would stand beside a king tiger, two silent hulks of steel. People would point, compare the figures, thicker armor, bigger gun. But no chart would ever capture the wave of fear that had broken the Panzerwaffe, turning men who once believed themselves invincible into soldiers surrendering before the battle began. The story of the Pershing was never just about a weapon. It was about the collapse of faith, about how, once an enemy no longer believes in his own superiority, the war is already over before a shot is fired. The Pershing didn't need to be everywhere. It only had to exist. And that was enough to bring a whole force to its knees. And so, in the spring of 1945, the war ended, not only with the roar of artillery, but with a cold truth. The belief in German supremacy was dead, and with it, the Panzerwaffe died too.